I'm so delighted to hold forth with you and sponsor what I anticipate, indeed know, will be a meaningful, provocative conversation with my friend, colleague, teacher, and a repeat visitor to Westchester Reformed Temple, Rabbi Jeff Salkin. So would you please take a moment while the sun still shines on this Yom Chag Ha'atzma'ut. Today is a festival day on the Jewish calendar, as we have marked, beginning with the setting of the sun last night, Israel's 75th anniversary of independent statehood, and have been making not just merry, but making meaning out of this milestone, recognizing that the ability to celebrate the independence of the state of Israel is, on the one hand, a modern miracle, and on the other hand, the example of what can happen when a people bands together to create something that has never been before and sheds blood, sweat, tears to preserve it, both body and soul, so that the Jewish state might also be a state of deep Jewish values and Jewish character. And for me, as for my colleague, as for all of us here tonight, that includes the preservation of Israel as a robust and thriving democratic state. So these are important times for the state of Israel, and our congregation's connection to Israel is what inspires us to come together throughout these days of making celebration and making meaning. Last night we had Achi Noam Nini, the great performing artist known as Noah, lift our voices in song and joy last night. And on Friday night, Rabbi Salkin will be returning to the Bima of Westchester Reformed Temple, and we will have an uplifting, family-friendly musical service that will celebrate Israel, and will also invite Rabbi Salkin and my friend Roy Newman, who is a young Israel emissary who is doing a gap year between high school and returning to Israel this summer to join the army. And Roy is one of several shinshinim, the name given to these young Israel emissaries who work under the shlicha, the chief Israel emissary of the Jewish Agency for Israel, in partnership with the UJA Federation of New York and the Westchester Jewish Council, to help our Westchester community connect with Israel. Roy will also share some reflections on Friday night. So that was all a long clause. The second half of it is, while the sun still shines on this Yom Chag Ha'atzma'ut, please take a moment to turn to somebody and wish that person a Chag Sameach, and introduce yourself by name. So if you haven't met the people in front of you, behind you, around you, please meet someone. No. So my friends, thank you. I am going to introduce our guest by way of sharing from an official biography, but I'm going to pepper it with a few additional personal insights. Rabbi Jeffrey Salkin is one of American Judaism's most prolific and most quoted rabbis. His blog, entitled Martini Judaism, for those who want to be shaken and stirred, published by the Religion News Service, won a 2022 Wilbur Award from the Religion Communicators Council for Best Religion Blog of the Year, as well as 2 previous awards. Rabbi Salkin's essays have appeared in the Washington Post, Commentary Magazine, the Wall Street Journal, the Huffington Post, Tablet, Mosaic, The Forward, and JTA, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. He has discussed the American political scene on CNN and the BBC, contributed articles to scholarly journals. His 10 books, of which I brought 2 for show and tell, discuss subjects including B'nai Mitzvah, most famously. In fact, somebody went up to Rabbi Salkin last night, never having met him in the flesh, but said, wait a minute, you're God on the guest list, Jeff Salkin. So this is a veritable classic. I have been sharing this book with upcoming B'nai Mitzvah students and their families for as long as I've been a rabbi, which, by the way, is 23 years. And so it is meaningful to have its author sitting right next to me, and perhaps even more personally meaningful for me is his book, Text Messages, a Torah commentary for teens, which he is the editor-in-chief. I have an essay in this book, and that's just one small way of saying thank you to a friend and colleague who has been a supportive presence and an encourager of my own rabbinate for a really long time now. He speaks also in his books about Israel, masculinity, Jewish culture, and has authored 3 Torah commentaries, of which that is one. He delivered the keynote on religion and spirituality at the Chautauqua Institution, as well as participating in interreligious dialogues in international forums. His colleagues have described him as courageous, always relevant, and one of American Judaism's true public intellectuals. His new book on the future of liberal Judaism will be published this autumn, and, by the way, occasions tonight's conversation. His previous books are all available on Amazon.com. He serves, at least for the next 5 minutes, as the Rabbi of Temple Israel in West Palm Beach, Florida, approaching his milestone of retirement. He has given a lifetime of service as a congregational rabbi, in addition to all of the other accomplishments which have filled my remarks up until this moment. And I suspect you're going to really fail at retirement, because this is a person who will gather no moss and will continue to lecture, speak, write, and engage Jewish congregations and audiences wherever he finds them. But for the meantime, he is the Rabbi of Temple Israel in West Palm Beach, Florida, where, by the way, the incoming rabbinic team is the duo of Ryan and Carly Daniels. Some of you may remember that Ryan Daniels was the intern of Westchester Reformed Temple for 3 years and now has the distinction of trying to fill very, very big shoes as one of, he and his wife will be Rabbi Salkin's successors. His hobbies include music, movies, bicycling, and consuming vast quantities of coffee. And so, you know, you've inspired me, Jeff, that this blog, it's such a clever title, Martini Judaism, for those who want to be shaken and stirred. I've decided that I'm going to start a blog called Mojito Judaism, for those who want to be muddled and vaguely sour. Without any further ado, please welcome Rabbi Jeff Salkin.
It really is a gift for me to be able to be with you. First of all, at the risk of false flattery, which is not false flattery, your Rabbi Jonathan Blake is really one of my favorite colleagues. Ever since he and I first met, despite the fact that there's about a decade or so of an age difference here, we are simpatico, we are kindred spirits, and he's one of the people that I turn to the most in my rabbinate. I am not kidding, for advice and for comfort and for reality checks. You are so blessed to have him. But I have to say that when I drove into the parking lot last night for Noah's concert, I got a little teary because it made me realize that the first time I drove into the parking lot of Westchester Reformed Temple was exactly 50 years ago. When I was a student at SUNY Purchase, I came to apply for a job teaching religious school, and I was hired. Of course, I had the opportunity to know, work with, work for, learn from, and bask in the indefatigable glory of Rabbi Jack Stern of blessed memory. The assistant rabbi director of the religious school at that time was Stuart Gertman, and then I worked with Peter Weintraub as well. And then when I was at HUC JAR in the 1970s, I came back and I taught religious school here as well. So this is really a homecoming for me. This is such a wonderful, precious place that has launched so many rabbinates, so many careers. Of course, I can't walk in here without thinking of Rabbi Rick Jacobs, who now has taken what he learned within these walls and is trying to apply that to a much more difficult, much more challenging palette, which is, of course, American Reform Judaism. That's what we are going to be talking about today, about Reform Judaism as an ideology. Jonathan could have said as well that I am one of the conveners, and I'm just throwing this out to all of you, of a conference that's going to be held May 31st, June 1st at Stephen Wise Free Synagogue in New York, called Recharging Reform Judaism, where we already have more than 300 people, Reform Jewish leaders, rabbis, professionals, and lay leaders, people in the pews who are gathering not to critique the institutions of Reform Judaism. We're not about that, but what we are about is raising the issue that we're going to be talking about tonight. Consider this, as you might, a laboratory. Where is Reform Judaism as an ideology going? And what might the future look like? So I'm not only here to teach you, but more than that, I want to be able to learn from you as well. We all have some Torah to teach. So you're all very busy, and I really thank you all for being here. I hope that this is a worthwhile use of your time, and before the end of the weekend, we will have encountered each other several times. And again, I don't take anything for granted. You all have a lot to do in your lives, that you actually spend the time learning about serious Judaism. This is an important gift. We need more Jews like you.
So I'm going to get the conversation rolling, and the first question will probably be the one that occasions the longest answer from my colleague. And then I have a few other questions, and we like to free associate, which is different from free dissociate. And then we'll open it up for your questions. But I would love to know more, before you get into the book that is coming out this fall. What do you mean when you talk about liberal Judaism? I'd love to start with a definition of terms. What does liberal Judaism mean? And probably just as important, what does it not mean?
Fine.
And then give us the overview of what you hope to accomplish in your new work.
Thank you. When I say liberal Judaism, it's in some ways a misnomer, but it's not as clunky as saying non-Orthodox Judaism. What I mean are all Jewish movements that are not Orthodox. Everything to the religious left, this is a very bad spatial metaphor. It actually comes, I think, from the British Parliament. Anything to the left of orthodoxy. That includes conservative Judaism, Reconstructionist Judaism, Reform Judaism, and I think it also obviously would include the smaller movements of humanistic Judaism, of New Age Judaism perhaps, Jewish renewal, and increasingly, and this is something that we really haven't grappled with, increasingly certain corners of modern orthodoxy as well would fit into this, at least sociologically. So we're talking about those Judaisms that have different relationships with halakha, with Jewish law, as would orthodoxy. I don't mean, because people get confused all the time, there's a difference between liberal Judaism and, let's flip it, Jewish liberalism. While it is the case, not for everybody, while it is the case that there is a very close relationship sociologically between Jews who are non-Orthodox and Jews who are politically and culturally liberal, we're not really talking about a political definition here. In general, the Pew Report will show you that the further to the left you are religiously, it is probably the case that the further to the left you are politically as well. That's not true everywhere. I think we all live in purple places now. I don't want to even get involved with politics. Listen, I'm a rabbi in Florida. I was just called by CNN today to comment on Governor DeSantis's visit to Israel. I should say that when I was on CNN a number of years ago commenting on the almost candidacy of someone who actually became president, the person who interviewed me no longer has a job. And so I just want to let you know that. Don Lemon, yes. So, yes, that's where we are.
So what do you hope to do in your book? What are the arguments you're going to lay out about where liberal Judaism, meaning, as you define it, non-Orthodox Judaism, is heading, needs to be heading, may not be heading?
I start with a story in the book which will have an echo this Friday night when I talk about how my young cousin lost her camera in Israel and how she found it again. The story I start with is something that happened last summer when I inadvertently left my suitcase on the sidewalk at Ben Gurion Airport, and the driver made a few phone calls, and 10 minutes later, I had my suitcase back. I thought it was a goner. It should have been. And when I tried to tip him, he said to me, "I'm not taking money from you." And then he quoted the mitzvah from Exodus and Deuteronomy of returning lost objects to people from memory. And then he said to me, "Anachnu achra'im," we are responsible. And I broke out into tears because this man had taught me something very valuable. By the way, right before Rosh Hashanah, I still had his phone number. I called him and I thanked him. I said, "I have sat at the feet of some of the greatest Jewish teachers of our time, Avi Yonah, but no one taught me more Judaism in less time in a more cramped space than you did." And he said, "May I give you a blessing for you to give to your community." It was a very powerful moment. But what moved me was, number one, Judaism was part of his everyday life. He knew the text. He wore a kippah, but he was not Orthodox. He was probably Yemenite. That will come up a little bit later. Number two, this idea that no, please do not mistake our relationship for a commercial relationship. I can't take money from you for doing a mitzvah. We are responsible. And so what moved me is that I believe that we have to bring responsibility back into Reform Judaism. And I reflect in the book on the various elements in our culture that are problematic for Judaism, but that non-Orthodox Judaism, for some reason, has yet to really confront. Number one, the culture of individualism. I am for myself, which chips away at the idea of community. When most people talk about community, they're really referring to the people they already know and like. But what I saw last night in the sanctuary at Westchester Reformed Temple was a true sense of community, whereby people would get together, even if they don't know each other, for a common purpose because they share common values. This is a communitarian sense, what Amitai Etzioni developed, that sense of I am responsible for you, what David Brooks writes about. Number two, we don't talk enough about what I call the culture of therapy, in which essentially I define my reality by what makes me feel good, what will make me whole. That, I think, has so filtered into the conversation in modern America that we are not even aware of it. Number three, part of that, the culture of consumerism. I am what I buy. I define who I am by what I can buy. And one of the things that saddens me, and I wrote a book about this as well, is how the entire notion of consumerism has not only trickled into the way we define ourselves, but more than that, how we even define the synagogue. And finally, a culture of technology. We do not question what technology has meant to us enough. We have not questioned what the ubiquity of the iPhone, the iPad, what the internet has meant. When Bill Clinton was inaugurated as president, there were something like 8 websites in America. And they, forgive me, I'll use a sad medical term, they metastasize. In other words, our lives are now lived totally on the web. Now we are confronting what happens when there's a program that can actually do a lot of our thinking for us. I'm talking about chatbot. I'm also referring to the fact that that program can construct a photograph for us out of thin air. That's how you wound up with that funny picture of the Pope recently. What happens when we are no longer able to trust our reality? Religious thinkers have not begun to grapple with that stuff at all. So in my book, I am saying that these are now the contemporary challenges that all religious traditions must, in fact, encounter. The last thing I'm going to say on this point is this. The Talmud says that any tsuris, I hope I don't have to translate that, any sorrow that the Jews have to bear by themselves, that's not such a tsuris. But any tsuris that the Jews share with the nations of the world, that's a tsuris. In other words, there is a sorrow that we share with the other nations, with other religions, which is simply this. Everything that I've mentioned is also true in vast corners of liberal Christianity and even increasingly in evangelical Christianity as well. And we're going to talk tonight and going forward about these little photographs of stuff that we're witnessing that testify to this. For example, a report came out this past week that says that between 2008 and 2019, supplementary religious schools lost about 50% of their students. You have a flourishing synagogue here. Let me tell you, Westchester Reformed Temple, I do not say this to falsely flatter you, is the envy of 98% of the synagogues in this movement. You have demographically one of the healthiest communities in America. This is unbelievable. You caused me to break the 10th commandment. I can think of 5 other suburban communities in America that have it this good and have the real possibility of a never-ending supply of people who are always going to want to move to a beautiful place. And you can name the other communities. I would say Newton, Massachusetts. I would say Short Hills, New Jersey. I would say Beverly Hills. I would say the North Shore of Chicago, certain areas around Atlanta, maybe Boca Raton, and that's about it. Okay. But you've lost how many?
I'm not good with percentages. I became a rabbi in part out of a deficiency to do math. My original design was to be an astronomer, and then I started taking courses in science and college. There's so much math, but I'll give you some numbers because numbers I get.
Book of numbers.
When I came to Westchester Reformed Temple as a 29, almost 30-year-old associate rabbi to work with Rick Jacobs, Angela Buchdahl, and Stephen Merkel of blessed memory, we had an ECC, an early childhood center, preschool, of about 160 students, 160 children between the ages of 2 and 5. Today that number is about 170. And that's largely because we have been at, and for most of the 20 years that I've been serving this community, remained at capacity, often with a wait list by this time of the year, not long after registration opened. Our then religious school, now known as the Jewish Learning Lab, was swelled with about 800 students between the grades of kindergarten and 12th grade. Today, the enrollment in the Jewish Learning Lab is about 472, give or take. My board members are here, will keep me honest on that one. So somewhere between 50 and 55% of where we were at our peak year, which was 2007. So
and yet,
16 years.
And yet your numbers, your congregational numbers have been either stable or growing. Most synagogues in America, most non-Orthodox synagogues in America can tell the same story. And there are, round up the usual suspects as to why this has happened. Most synagogues in America are smaller today than they were 5 years ago. To wit, I am reading the placement materials put forth by the Central Conference of American Rabbis that congregations fill out when they're looking for new rabbis. I'm not telling you anything that's not public knowledge. with maybe one exception, over the last 3 or 4 years, every synagogue looking for a rabbi is significantly smaller than it once was. And you will say, but, Rabbi Salkin, COVID. And you won't be wrong, but here's what you need to know. COVID only exacerbated sociological issues that were present all along. Now, I will also be the first to admit, we will not know the effect of COVID on the American psyche. I will say, I'm going to make a sociological prediction. It's going to take a decade for this to play itself out. I'm not even talking about for the end of the pandemic to happen. It's going to take 10 years before we have any kind of literature, which is to say fiction, nonfiction, and analysis of what this has done to America. But I'm also saying American religious life did not need COVID for this to happen. Now, we have a deeper conversation. I'll tell you what I think is missing from American religious life, but that's a whole other story. That's what my book is about. My book is about how do we get our Jewish mojo back as a liberal movement.
So I recently read a book by Danny Schiff, Rabbi Danny Schiff, Rabbi Dr. Danny Schiff, who happens to be the scholar in residence at the Jewish Federation of Pittsburgh. He is an ordained Reform rabbi of vintage, a little bit around when you were in
a little bit
rabbinical
younger, just a little bit younger than me, and he's a good friend.
Great. Lives in Jerusalem,
Yes,
and
does.
he was brought in to be a scholar in residence and dialogue facilitator with a group of about 30 rabbis, all Reform, mostly senior rabbis, meaning rabbis who are the senior rabbi in their congregations, mostly in larger congregations from across the US and Canada. We met at the scenic O'Hare Hilton in Chicago for 48 hours of stimulating conversation around Schiff's new book, which is called Judaism in a Digital Age. And it's broken into 3 sections. First section is all history or analysis of where we got, or how we got to where we are. And he also talks about liberal Judaism in the sense of non-Orthodox Judaism. Mm-hmm. So he really keeps his focus laser sharp on Reform and conservative Judaism, although he, like you, would acknowledge that to some extent within Orthodoxy, we see some of these trends playing out as well, but he largely does not want to take up what's happening in Orthodoxy because the solutions that Orthodoxy proposes for confronting this moment are in some ways substantially or even fundamentally different from the solutions he thinks will be appropriate for the non-Orthodox movements. And it begins with an overview of movements. So I'm going to summarize a couple of his ideas and then sort of ask you to weigh in here. He says that the purpose of a movement in Judaism was to move people. In other words, it implies not being static or accepting a status quo that may have persisted not unchanged, but largely static for centuries, which is Jews as second-class citizens by the law of whatever European or other nation in which Jews found themselves as residents, often relegated to ghettos, often regulating their own societal norms and mores through their own practices, procedures, leadership, and even their own kind of independent, we would call it judiciary. It wasn't that they weren't subject to the laws of the state, but it was that the state wouldn't get involved in matters of marriage and birth and death and diet and all of the things that Jews care about. And that Jews lived a life apart for most of the last 2,000 years. Come Napoleon, come the Enlightenment, come all of the upheaval of the late 18th century, Jews left the ghettos, Jews were emancipated politically, and also sought the new opportunities for freedom of intellectual discourse, to participate in the life of the modern nation state, to have jobs just like their Christian fellow citizens, because they were now citizens for the first time, to practice their religion. In fact, for the first time, Jews were told that what you do is a religion. They had just thought of it as like a folk way, a way of life. And at that moment, Reform Judaism is born, when it says, we will undertake a deliberate program to reform Judaism to the end that Jews can participate in modern life. And Schiff goes on in this first part of the book to say, and we did it. It took us 150 years. But by 1960, what we began as a reform movement in the first decade of the 19th century was largely accomplished. We were now accepted, we Jews, as fully participatory in the American project, and that anti-Semitism would no longer hold us back. And today, by the way, if you don't accept 1960 as the mission accomplished date, ask any kid who's growing up in Scarsdale today whether or not being Jewish is an impediment to achieving what they want to in life. To a person, I will tell you, they don't see that at all. That's totally invisible to them. Anti-Semitism is something that their parents or grandparents worry about, and that they may, in an abstract way, think about or worry about, but it does not really factor into what they think will matter in their lives. Schiff goes on from here to say, because we succeeded, the movements are dead. We've outlived our purpose. And the biggest problem for Reform and conservative Jews today is that we lack a mission. In other words, there's nowhere to move Jews anymore, or if the mission is getting Jews out of the ghetto to participate fully in modern life, then there is no point anymore because victory. The problem now, among many others, in a culture of hyper-individualism, in a culture that disintegrates the idea of community, in a culture of hyper-connectivity to technology, not necessarily to other people, but to devices, in a world where we will be able to generate artificial intelligence that might actually fundamentally alter our understanding of what we mean when we talk about reality, humanity, consciousness. Non-Orthodox Judaism is completely unprepared to confront any of those challenges.
No question.
Okay, so your thoughts on this?
Well, you said a lot, Jonathan. First of all,
This book is the thing that's keeping me up at night right now, by the way.
And not large amounts of coffee. That's what keeps me awake. You see, what's really interesting is, and I said this to Danny Schiff, is that the two E's that he talks about, emancipation and enlightenment, for the first time are endangered in our society. So, for example, while it is true that our children have nothing to fear about their Jewish identity keeping them out of anything, for me, the signal moment was in the year 2000 when Senator Joseph P. Lieberman was the vice presidential candidate, a serious, either modern Orthodox or right-wing / conservative Jew, by the way, whose present wife was the first wife of Rabbi Gordon Tucker. Okay, so there are rabbis in his extended mishpacha, as it were. When President Trump's daughter converted to Judaism, and by the way, I am told from the rabbi who handled it, the most prominent Orthodox rabbi in New York, took it very, very seriously. Whatever else you think of the family, let's not impugn that. When you have Douglas Emhoff, who was the first gentleman, we won, except for the George Soros piece, which is that now George Soros's name is invoked as a dog whistle in certain places, and that really means the Jews. In terms of the Enlightenment, we thought that logic and rationality would win out, except that what we're seeing all over America now is that people really aren't being very rational, that truth is very much up for grabs, and that even intellectual acuity is no longer what it used to be. So yes, I think Danny Schiff is absolutely right. We won. We won. We got what we wanted. But now the bigger question is this. In the words of my rabbi, Peggy Lee, is that all there is? And one of the things that I find to be predominantly true about Judaism today, and one of the things that I think is the open door for the renewal of Jewish life in America, is the notion that Judaism comes to ask questions that nothing else is asking. What are my limits? I'm going to be talking about this on Shabbat morning when we talk about Kedoshim. What limits do I have to my life? How do I live in community and balance my sense of individualism? Or to get to the really gut questions that keep you up in the middle of the night. What do I do now? As David Brooks puts it, and I spoke about this when I addressed Chautauqua, in his book, The Second Mountain, he talks about how the first mountain of life is the mountain of what he calls the resume virtues. But what happens is that at a certain point you fall off that mountain, you're kicked off that mountain, or you descend that mountain, and in the next stage of life, I'm looking around, and many of us are at that stage of life, we ascend the second mountain, and that's what we call the eulogy virtues. In other words, how do I create more meaning in my life? Any good religion is going to give you that. And so let me now end with a hopeful note. A good non-Orthodox Judaism will actually do what a good Orthodox Judaism has done. Orthodox Judaism is very good at asking those questions because it has a toolbox and it has a set of rules about how to live. The Orthodox encounter with modernity, with emancipation, enlightenment, etc., it might be full-blown. Their kids go to Princeton, Yale, Harvard, etc. They're not in the ghetto anymore, but there's a Velcro that they can return to, you see? And so what I'm looking for is how do we create a Reformed Judaism that's not merely cliches, that's not merely social justice. In a conversation with Rabbi Larry Hoffman today at the Mamaroneck Diner, very good omelet, by the way, I hardly recommend. I've been just doing nothing but eating at diners this week. I have to because I live in Florida.
I took him to the Metro tonight for dinner.
I had to. He asked me, do you think that social justice is the most important thing in Reform Judaism? I said, well, I'm actually someone who is a dissident there. I actually think that that's not why most people are part of a religious tradition. I'm not sure that we should be the left wing of the Democratic Party with better songs. As it was said of the Episcopal Church once upon a time, that it was the Republican Party at prayer. He said, well, what do you think it should be? And I invented on the spot a little quip that I'll pass on to you. I said, social justice is nice, but social capital is even more important. Most people are looking for ways to increase their social capital, their way of connecting to other people, of creating communities of meaning. Now, that can happen through social justice, and there's nothing wrong with that. But what I'm saying is that there are gut-level existential questions. What does my life mean? What happens when I die? What if I leave my kids? This is the bread and butter of any good, solid religious tradition. And when we reclaim that, then we're going to find that we can rebuild Judaism, not in our image, but in the way it was always supposed to be. And I'll go one step further. Why should Jews have all the fun? I think we've got a great message here. And while it has always been the case that, not always, but for the last 40 years, that we've been open to non-Jews, Gentiles entering our gates through intermarriage, etc. Outreach, I was the rabbinic chair of the Outreach Commission for the Reform Movement for about 7 years. One of the things that Rabbi Schindler of blessed memory had said that never got put into any kind of action form was that there are many people in this country who are spiritually hungry. And you and I know something. We know that Judaism, and especially our version of it, can compete in the intellectual marketplace of ideas. And we need to put that out there. And that's one of the reasons why I write, because I think Judaism has something to say to all people. And that's a very Jewish idea, and it's a very Reformed Jewish idea. It's like what Glinda, the Good Witch, said to Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz. You always had the power, my dear. We always had the power to make Judaism into what it needs to be. And the time is now.
I'm going to ask one more question, and we're going to open it up. I don't want to miss the opportunity, while the sun still shines, to talk a little bit about Israel. Jeff, I've known you to be an ardent supporter of, defender of Israel, not just as an idea, but as an essential cornerstone of Jewish identity, and yes, that includes Reformed Jewish identity. When you think about Israel in conversation with non-Orthodox Judaism, what do you feel? What do you think? What keeps you up at night? What would get you up in the morning?
I'm going to say some of this on Friday night, but I'll lay it out for you in a slightly more sophisticated way. What I experience in Israel is something that my Christian colleagues understand intuitively. I haven't put this in print. It would raise eyebrows. I'm not sure that I would say it from the pulpit here because it might be jarring. So here goes. I don't want to push the metaphor too far. Like Will Rogers, I never metaphor I didn't like. But let me say this. The juxtaposition at the end of Nisan and the beginning of ER between Yom HaShoah and then a week later Yom HaAtzmaut is tantamount. Please don't take me too seriously. I'm sketching this for you. Is tantamount to saying that Yom HaShoah was the Good Friday of Jewish history. It was, as the Protestant theologian called it, the crucifixion of the Jews. The state is Easter Sunday, where the stone gets rolled away and the Jewish people rises from the ashes. A profound piece of my Zionism comes from that. Resurrection. This is the resurrection of the Jewish people as a people with power, as a people with purpose, as a people that has a language that was consigned to the dustbins of history. One of the things I'll say on Friday night is that when I go to synagogue in Jerusalem, inevitably I sit near the window so I can have a stereophonic experience of Hebrew. With one ear, I get to hear the service chanted in language that Isaiah would understand, and with the other ear, I get to hear Jewish children yelling at each other and even taunting each other in modern Hebrew. It is the resurrection of a language and a culture, number one. Number two, those of you who remember high school with any degree of fondness, that would be both of you, would recall that on Monday and Tuesday you went to biology class or chemistry, and then Wednesday and Thursday you had lab. On Monday and Tuesday you sat at the desks. Wednesday and Thursday you went to lab, and you saw how what you learned was translated into reality. The history of Judaism from the 9th of Av in the year 70 until 1948, May 14th to be precise, was the Monday and Tuesday of Jewish history. We sat at the desks, we created the texts, we studied the texts. Israel is the Wednesday and Thursday of Jewish history. Israel is the lab whereby we are able to see whether these bones live, not only to quote the language of Ezekiel, but do these values actually have legs? So that is my Zionism. My Zionism is the Zionism for those who need it and those who want it. The Schiff family left Pittsburgh and made Aliyah to Jerusalem, not because of Tree of Life. By the way, the jury selection just began 2 days ago, and I actually met a man who is part of the project, which is trying to make sure that Robert Bowers, the shooter, doesn't get the death penalty. I'm actually recording a podcast with this guy next week. It's going to be really interesting. He didn't leave because of anti-Semitism in America, though Tree of Life was the 5 worst minutes in American Jewish history. You know that. That in 5 minutes, the total number of Jews who had died in anti-Semitic violence in American history doubled. Doubled. No, he left because they wanted to live a Jewish life. So Zionism, Israel, is for those people who need it. Jews from Argentina, Jews from the former Soviet Union, the survivors who won a victory 75 years ago this week under ridiculous odds, incredible odds. The Jews of the Arab lands who fled with nothing. But it's also for Jews who want a fuller self-definition. And for that reason, I believe that Israel is the greatest accomplishment of the last 2,000 years of Jewish history. Someone said to me, the Talmud's not too shabby. I said, yeah, it's okay. But I think that the state is the most important thing that we've ever done. Now, of course, I also have to say the following. Isn't it sad that we always have to throw in this note? Israel's not perfect, okay? By the way, let me just suggest something to you. Neither is America, and if you lived in Luxembourg, well, no, Luxembourg probably is perfect. Well, that's the burden of, you see, if you live in a country that doesn't have power, then you can afford to be morally pure. Isn't that interesting, right? I have said to people that I would rather suffer with the vulgarity of Israeli power than have to say Kaddish all the time. In other words, power is subject to a moral vocabulary. Powerlessness isn't. And not only that, you and I know that powerless people, when they get scared and angry, are very likely to commit acts of terror. Being powerless, I'll use the Yiddish again, being powerless is not such a mitzvah. It's not such a bargain. I'd rather we have too much power and have to apologize than have no power and the nation speak well of us at our funeral. Number 2, what haunts me is this. I've been told by people, oh, Jeff, just tone it down. Stop it already. No, I think we're in danger. I think we're in really, 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 really big danger of losing the dream. I think we're in really big danger, not of Israel not being a democracy, but of Israel abandoning democratic values. And I'll say something else. I think the danger to Israel is much worse than the danger is to America. One bad presidency in America that doesn't go the way we want, we've discovered that America is pretty resilient, though there will be deep wounds that will be caused by anything that happens in this country. But in Israel, because it's so small and because of its lack of any kind of constitutional protection, we're talking about existential dangers. Now, what gives me hope? I'll tell you what gives me hope. I'm looking out into this crowd. I'm guessing some of you are probably my age or a little bit older, and some of you are graduates of the late 1960s and early 1970s. And some of you probably protested the war in Vietnam. And probably some of you were present when people burned American flags, or as Abby Hoffman, Alav Shalom, did, turned the American flag into a shirt. Right? We did that. We dishonored the American flag. That's not what Israelis are doing. Israelis are going to the streets, now more than 10% of the entire population. You want to think about what that means in American terms? and they are waving Israeli flags. And what they are saying should inspire every single person here. What they are saying to the government is, you don't own Zionism. This country is our land. Woody Guthrie got it right. This land is your land, this land is my land. From Jerusalem up to the Golan. I just made that up. That's pretty good. They're saying this Zionist dream that we fought for, how dare you? How dare you besmirch it? How dare you ruin it? How dare you vulgarize it? How dare you embarrass us in the eyes of the nations of the world? How dare you make us plead for our dignity again? We fought for this. This is what, this, and you know, there's a Talmudic expression, ad k'dei kach, we've come this far. For you to screw with our heads this way? No way. As American Jews, we need to pour all of our energies into the NGOs and those forces within Israel that are fighting for the Israel that we love. This is not just about women of the wall. It's not just about reformed Jewish rights. This is, okay, frankly, most Israelis do not care very much about women of the wall. They really don't care very much about the Kotel at all. This is not number one on their list of things to worry about. But they do want a state that's diverse, they do want a state that's pluralistic, and we do too. And God has given us a spectacular opportunity at the 75th birthday to make our Zionism really, really sing. When I heard last night, you know, the quote from Hatikva, Lihiot am chofshi ba'artzenu, to be a free people in our land, the Rashi, the commentary on that is, free of the mishigas, free of the neuroses that we imported from the diaspora, that you've imposed on us, free of this mentality. We are here to create a new Jew. Let us create that new Jew. End of sermon.
Thank you. I have so many thoughts on that.
Okay.
But I want to open it up to any comments, questions for our guest on where we're going, what we're concerned about, what it means to be a Reformed Jew at this important juncture. Yeah, I'm going to call on you by name. This is Jordan.
Yeah, I met Jordan earlier. Hi, Jordan.
Yeah, okay, so use it. Use your big room voice.
It's a really good question. Let me buy into one of the things that you said and actually agree with you. When people ask me, what religion are you? What people are you? By the way, notice that I would give the same answer to both those questions. And that's very unusual. That's one of the things that drives people crazy and fascinates people about Judaism. We are simultaneously a religion and a people. And any attempt to sever the connection between those, in the South, they like to say that we were Judaism by religion, but we're like everybody else. And in the North, the ethnic way of looking at it was, I like Seinfeld, but I'm not religious. I do not identify myself as a Reform Jew. I'm a Jew. If I'm with a group of colleagues and my institutional affiliation comes up as a subject, I say, yes, I'm a Reform rabbi. I was ordained by a Reform institution. I am employed by a Reform synagogue. But I'm a Jew. I would encourage everybody here to drop the word. I know this doesn't sound like the thing you want me to say, but I would encourage everybody out in the world, drop Reform as an adjective. It almost sounds too much like Jewish with an explanation. We're Jews. We happen to be members of a Reform synagogue, and that's what commands our loyalty, number one. Number two, I've never met an Orthodox Jew who says that I'm not a Jew. What they do say, when they're being tasteless, is your Judaism is not Judaism. And so therefore I say, well, we're going to have to just disagree on that. And that might be my cop-out and my way of walking away from an argument, because I happen to know something. We're not going to convince each other. It may also be the case that, as the late Jacob Neusner, who had taught at Brown University, taught, it is true that there is not one Judaism. There are many Judaisms, which is to say there are many Judaic systems, and Orthodoxy is a system of thought and behavior that is coherent in and of itself. The most we can hope for is mutual respect. And by the way, I've discovered, largely through hanging out with Orthodox rabbis, that you can often get that level of respect. They might say, I disagree with you on A, B, and C, but I've discovered that when it comes to D, E, and F, usually communal things, we often see things the same way. I'll also go one step further, and I'll say that I respect other Jews, and I respect their opinions, and I respect their worldviews. It would be nice if I could get that in return. That's not always the case. There are days when I let the darkness conquer me, where I say that I don't want to play with you unless you're willing to play with me. And there are other days where I feel a little bit more gracious than that. And a lot of it just really depends on my mood. I will say this. We have really one tradition, and we enter that tradition through many different doors. What I find to be most helpful is the 3H system. Judaism is the head, the heart, and the hand. The head is study, the heart is liturgy and spirituality, and the hand is activism and doing. This might be very helpful to you. What I've learned in life is this. Most Jews major in one H, they minor in a second H, and the third H, they just can't pull together. This roughly lines up with Al Shlosha Devarim, okay? Al Torah, the world stands on three things, Al Ha'avodah, and on worship, Al Gemilut Chasadim, and on acts of goodness. You know, you probably will say to yourself, oh yeah, I'm a head Jew, I'm a heart Jew, I'm a hand Jew. That's my major. My minor is the second thing that I like to do. And the third thing, I don't know, I'm just not good at it. Now, someone asked me, was there any Jew in history who pulled off all three? The only person I can think of was Heschel.
Me too. That's exactly what I was going to say.
Just Heschel.
Abraham Joshua Heschel.
Maybe Abraham Joshua Heschel. Someone said, what about Elie Wiesel? I said, maybe. Someone said the Lubavitcher Rebbe. I said, that's a close runner-up. I think so. But my canonical Jew who hits all three cylinders would be Heschel. Now, I say this to give you comfort, which is to say, I can't do it all. But isn't it great that sitting next to me in synagogue is someone who has my H that I can't pull together, and that's why I live in a community. You got the picture? I hope that's helpful to people.
I find that when Reform Jews approach our Orthodox counterparts in the community as partners and not as opponents, I am almost always met with a respectful embrace. That kind of relationship infuses my dynamic with Rabbi Jonathan Morgenstern of Young Israel of Scarsdale, whom I regularly consult on matters of Jewish law and practice. And he is fully cognizant of the fact that my way of leading this community is fundamentally different from his way of leading his community. I think where we converge and where we draw strength from and with each other, and what really grounds our friendship, not just our collegiality and the respect we have for each other, but our friendship, is we both believe with every fiber of our being that the sum total of the way in which we serve the Jewish people is bringing Jewish people closer to Judaism.
Amen.
So I often ask him, hey, I've got a dilemma with a congregant with a certain matter pertaining to burial or end of life for a parent. I need to know what the Orthodox practice is around this, and I know what the book says, but tell me what you actually do when you counsel. And he'll tell me this is what you do, and I will say, well, if I deviate, I want you to know I'm giving him advice as a Reform rabbi would. And he said, it means so much to me just that you called. Right? And I feel the same way about him. Though I know that that kind of friendship and collegiality does not obtain in many relationships and in many communities. So I feel very blessed.
Let me go one step further. I'm glad you have that relationship with him. In a community like Scarsdale, New Rochelle, White Plains, or basically anything that's connected by the Heathcote bypass. In this triangle of communities where you have a thickness of Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox Jews, here's a fun project. Why don't Jews treat each other the way we treat Christians? Why don't we have dialogue? Why don't we have Jews of different stripes and flavors sitting together and studying together and learning from each other? I have discovered the most redemptive thing in my rabbinate is when I hang out with other Jews and I learn stuff, and the walls come tumbling down. You can make a real difference in the Jewish world just by doing that.
Right. Yeah, my least favorite moments in congregational leadership come, for instance, and I won't diss any person or group, but sometimes, you're in a Torah study, and the way in which people will find some kind of way of lifting up the kind of Judaism we practice is by demeaning another form of Jewish practice. And say, well, this is not what the Orthodox do. It's that conversation that I really don't tolerate. Or similarly, well, unlike other religions, the fact of the matter is all religions have their liberals and their orthodoxies.
I also think what's really important, Jonathan, and I say this to everybody, when you compare the best to the best, not the best to the worst. In other words, let's look at the best Orthodox rabbis and compare them to your rabbis. Let's not play the game of comparing Rabbi Blake, Rabbi Stern, Alav Shalom, Rabbi Jacobs, may he live to be 120. Let's not make the mistake of comparing them to those people. And I don't want to say those people, it's such a terrible thing, to rabbis in Muncie or in New Square or whatever, or who have stood by and watched the educational programs of children. I don't want to go there. That's not a fair fight. That's not a fair fight, especially when you ask yourself the following question. With all the poverty in those communities, why are there not gaping social problems in the ways that we would have thought? Mm-hmm. And I'll tell you why. Those communities live gemilut chasadim. They live chesed. This is what they do. A bride can't afford a wedding dress. The community gets together. She goes to a right. They do this. Now, to be fair, they do take food stamps. That is their right, okay? But there is a rather surprising low percentage of people who are actually on the welfare rolls. In terms of education, that's a scandal. In terms of kids who are abusing substances or whatever, this is a terrible story. But I get no nachas from these stories. This does not make me happy. It does not make me feel self-righteous or I don't even feel shame. I feel sadness. But the deal is this: let's always compare the best to the best, and you'll discover that we have so much more in common. Or let me put it to you this way. You compare your life, your lifestyle as an active member of a Reformed synagogue to your friend who is an active member of a conservative synagogue, to your cousin who is an active member of the Orthodox community. And you know what you're going to discover? Your life rhythms are remarkably similar. You will have more in common with them than you will with the person who is a member of a Reformed synagogue in name only and doesn't do very much. It's a very interesting, there's something in this. I'm urging you to look at it that way.
Thank you. Other questions or comments? Bob in the front row.
This has been my home for my entire life, yet it's not the center of my life. Westchester Reformed Temple grew in and amongst a society of upward mobile people with lots of money. The congregation here doesn't use this building and this organization, and this is all my opinion, that as the center of their life, and the more orthodox, through conservative to orthodox, the synagogue, excuse me, the synagogues become the center of their life. They are not the center here. How many people come to Friday night services? Yes, COVID got in the way, but there's just so much that maybe I'm missing, okay? I've been Jew all my life. When I was in the military, I decided to be the rabbi of the 7th Fleet. But I had no training. I did that because I'm a hands-on Jew rather than a head Jew. With my heart, second place. And I find that the Jewish community is mobile here. It's moving north. We've lost congregants. We used to have 35 people on a waiting list. We don't have a waiting list anymore because we're limited to a few people coming in. But how many adults where their kids are here in the educational program and they're all for that, but as soon as they got bar mitzvah, they disappear. It's a different type of reality that we live in, and I'm not sure that it's ever going to go back.
So let me frame it for you this way, Bob. Here's a fun way to understand the different movements in American Judaism. We're going to put them on a continuum. And it goes like this. The question is, in your life, how much of the tradition and the community and how much of modernity? How much of the tradition and the community goes in, and how much modernity, how much of the modern world, okay? The further you go to the right, the more the proportion is of the tradition and community and the less modernity you have. In fact, it's never 100% zero, even among the Haredim. The more to the left you get, the smaller the percentage of the tradition and the community, and the more of the premises of modernity, which I outlined, which Rabbi Schiff does as well. So by definition, this is something very interesting. By definition, Judaism takes up less mental and psychic space in the lives of people who are Reform, and then a little bit more people who are conservative, and a lot more people who are Orthodox. That's just the way it is. Look at the Pew study. Now, I wish it were not that way. In other words, what I would like, I'm suspecting you might want this as well, is a level of religious intensity among Reform Jews in which this is as important to us as it is to our conservative and Orthodox brothers and sisters. I don't think that's impossible, but we haven't really succeeded in making that happen yet, maybe because we haven't tried everything, and I don't know what that should be. Number two, Jonathan and I were talking about this earlier, and on the 8th day, God made demographics. We are a wandering people. In Florida, for example, most communities last about 10 or 15 years before people leapfrog that community and then go to the next big place. Because Jews like new construction. Or if they're moving north, they like old construction that they can make new, okay? That's just the way of the world. That is true in every single Jewish community in America with one exception. And that is Squirrel Hill, Pittsburgh. The tragedy of what happened at Tree of Life was that it happened in Squirrel Hill in the middle of an upscale Jewish shtetl, the last shtetl in America, when you walked, I was there several weeks after the tragedy, when you walked down Murray Avenue, which is the main drag in that area of Pittsburgh, and there are the photographs and the names of the victims in every single shop window, even those shops that are not owned by Jews, because these were our people, okay? What you had in Squirrel Hill until relatively recently, and Mark Oppenheimer's book on the tragedy is very instructive. There may be one other community in America where you don't have that kind of mobility, and that's Brookline. That's at Brookline, Boston, okay? But in Squirrel Hill, you had until relatively recently a phenomenon where there was housing stock at all economic levels, so that when you got rich, you didn't have to move. You just traded up to a different house. That has changed over the last 5 to 10 years, but that sociologically is what we call a thick community. Or it's what we found in the opening credits of the TV show Cheers. Sometimes you want to go where everybody knows your name. Or what the New York Times columnist Anna Quinlan said, and you'll forgive me, she said, when my father was a kid growing up in Jersey City, there were 7 people in 7 square blocks who had permission to hit him. The cop, the nun, the priest, the shop owner.
I also think that in the 21st century, certainly among my generation and the generations after me, who would be the millennial generation, I'm Gen X, so the millennials and the Gen Z or post-millennial generations, do not actually desire necessarily to live in a community where everyone knows your name, right? And that's a function of the hyper-individualism and the fact that people find, I think, a paltry surrogate for community in their devices, right? So that is part of this too. And even Jews of the baby boomer generation before me and the greatest generation before them seem to feel a little bit more free to move out to places where not everyone may know their names, as long as they have a small group of 2 or 3. But long gone, I think, are the days where people would go into taking out a synagogue affiliation with the assumption that this is going to be their place for life.
I think you're right, and I think Well, I want to ask you.
And you're not sui generis, Bob, but you defy the norms. You are part of an increasing or a decreasing number of congregants who have been here from, the cradle until senior citizenship.
I also think that at a certain point in American Jewish history, and Label Fine, the late Leonard Fine of blessed memory, wrote about this in his what was then groundbreaking study of Reform Judaism called Reform as a Verb, which came out in 1973. It's in your library, trust me. And where he basically said that for most Reform Jews, the house of worship is not a home. And that even back then, most Reform Jews never believed that the synagogue was going to be their social center. Or, let me put it to you this way. It was more true before we got into country clubs. And I'm not being cute. In other words, when the Jewish community was compact, economically, essentially a one-class community, which is to say middle class, and country clubs didn't take Jews, or there were no, as in Westchester, I did a study on this when I was in college, I know too much about this, or before there was a parallel Jewish structure of, like in Purchase, where I went to, there's Old Oaks, which was for the Russian Jews, and there was the Century Country Club, which was for the our crowd, the German Jews, etc. And there's Rayburn, who knows who went there. But before there was a parallel Jewish country club structure, people needed synagogues and neighborhoods for their primary sense of community. So let me ask you something. Among your peers and people younger than you, because you said something that really now makes me think, has in fact social media become the community, become the neighborhood?
No. I think what has changed. Now, look, I'm a bad case study because I'm the rabbi. Right? I don't fit into the boxes of my peers. My Jewish peers are a motley crew. I have Jewish peers who are my congregants, and by definition, they are in Scarsdale in part because of the neighborhood feel of being in Scarsdale, and even like the neighborhoods within the bigger neighborhood of Scarsdale. And Scarsdale residents tend to take not just pride, but an extreme investment of civic service in order to make sure that this is a thriving community that provides not the sense of neighborhood, but it provides community. I think that by and large, Scarsdale aspires to be a model community with all of its challenges. So my people, though, okay, good. But I just spoke to a friend of mine, an old college friend of mine. He's a reporter for the New York Times. And he said, so here's the deal, John, I've got a dilemma. He said, I have a 10-year-old daughter. She's going into 5th grade. And this is a friend of mine who writes for the New York Times. He grew up in Scarsdale. He grew up at Scarsdale Synagogue, by the way. He says, I never want to set foot in a synagogue ever again. So it's not my jam. And we have the kind of relationship where I can talk about it. I'm not there to pester him. He lives in Queens now. He says, but here's the funny thing. Because a number of his New York Times colleagues, including Jodi Kantor, the Pulitzer Prize winner who's coming to speak at WRT May 11th, don't miss that night, and her husband, Ron Lieber, who was our resident counselor our freshman year at college, my friend Dan took a recommendation from his journalist friends and sent his kid to Eisner Camp, one of the reform movements, one of the URJ camps up in Great Barrington. Lo and behold, now he has a kid who's been going to camp for 5 years who says, Daddy, Mommy, I want a bat mitzvah. He says, so how do I do that without a synagogue? Now, I'm not going to tell you what I said. I'm going to tell you that that's an example of somebody my age. So I don't think social media anyone who spent enough time in social media, unless you're a teenager, in which case you think TikTok is life, it's a setting sun. There's no there. It's vacuous. It's non-community. I've largely withdrawn from interacting on social media because of that, foremost, and secondarily, because every attempt I made to create elevated conversation was dragged down into a mire of toxicity and lowest common denominator prevailing. So no, I don't think social media is the surrogate. I think it's actually something even more vexing than that, which is that my generation, and especially the generations after me, don't know of this thing called community, and therefore it's not a desire of theirs to be in community. They have the friends they want to have. It's very transient. You have your friends if you're a parent, you have the friends of your kids' parents. You have, if you want to join a social club, a pool, a country club, a Hampton share, you find friends that way. You have your work friends. You have your college friends that now you can Zoom with once a month on a Saturday night. But there's no perceived added benefit to living in a community provided by geographical boundaries, like a community that just exists because you all live near one another. I'm gonna ask one more question before we wrap up. Yep.
I'm going to take what you said. I heard the beginning and the second part. I can pretty much reassemble the middle. I'm going to say the following. My cell phone number is 404-314-9136. I don't live in 404. When I got this phone, I lived in Atlanta, and so people say to me, "Oh, do you live in Atlanta?" I said, "No, my phone does."
Right.
And I never got a new phone. When I moved back to New York, when I moved to New Jersey, when I moved to South Florida, I'm still 404, though I live in a 561. I think this is a metaphor, which is to say that in the cyber world, you can be anyone and be anywhere. And now I'm going to go one step further. I'm connecting a dot here that is outrageous, but I've been thinking about this for years. Is the loss of space, therefore, part of a diminishing sense among younger Jews of a connection to the land of Israel?
So you took me back to where I wanted to go, because I felt that your comments required a little bit further clarification, especially for people who don't know you as an ardent Zionist. When people ask me what I think about Israel, I say Israel is the future of the Jewish people. And when they say, well, what could you possibly mean by that? I say, no, it's not a statement of feeling. That's a logic statement. Today, more than half of the world's 15.3 million Jews live in Israel. Their children will live in Israel. I believe that the most exciting developments in Jewish culture, in medicine that is being performed by Jews, in high tech that is being engineered by Jews, in entrepreneurship and economic development that is being helmed by Jews, it's all happening in Israel. And even if you want to say that there is a rival Jewish community of equal stature and importance here in North America, which is also a true statement, that's fine, but it does not change the fact that there is no Jewish future without Israel. There is no Jewish future without Israel. So in some ways, Israel's dilemma is similar to the one that Schiff outlines for Reform and conservative Jews here in diaspora. We did it. Despite the threats from Iran and the threats from Palestinian terrorists we saw carrying out grievous attacks against innocent Jewish civilians even within the last 72 hours in Israel. Even with that, no major credible existential threat against Israel from an outside party or people has threatened the Jewish people since Sadat and Begin signed their treaty. And Sadat paid with the price of his life, by the way. So that's 1977. There has not been a massive invasion of Israel in almost 50 years. Now, there are other threats. You even use the word existential. But I would love for you to clarify your meaning on what is the importance of Eretz Yisrael and Medinat Yisrael, the land of Israel, the state of Israel, and Am Yisrael, the people of Israel, to a Reformed Jew, like any number of kids growing up in this congregation, whose only experience of Israel may be on a birthright trip?
It's a really good question. I think that beyond my cursory outline of where my Zionist loyalties come from, which is a sense of home and a sense of laboratory, I think that what Israel does is it provides us with a context by which we feel a sense of kinship with all Jews. It is, in fact, Jewish peoplehood that is at the very core of what we are talking about. But I'm going to take what you said even more seriously. I think the future is here. Someone once said, the future is here, it just hasn't been evenly distributed. I think the future for Israel is already here, which is that within 5 or 10 years or so, the vast majority of Jewish infants in the world will speak Hebrew as their first language. And therefore, I think not only because of technological and medical advances that are happening, but by sheer numbers, it will be necessary for us to feel a kinship with the Jewish state and to realize that our fate is bound up with theirs. But more than that, to pause and ask ourselves the question, why is it that of all the countries in the world, this one attracts the most press attention, this one attracts the most hatred, and also, paradoxically, the most admiration? And I think the reason for that, which we don't understand anywhere nearly enough, is that the story of Israel itself is a story of human transcendence. It's a story of miracle. It's a story of homecoming, yes, against all possible odds. In 1945, we were a people wearing striped pajamas. In 1948, we were wearing uniforms. This is a very, very big deal. And your question presupposes another question, which is that I think for most American Jews, this drama has been elusive. And I think for most American Jews, we have what the poet Yehuda Amichai would have called a tourist's experience of Jewish peoplehood. But I would like it to touch us more deeply. And I think Birthright has succeeded massively that way, in ways that we could not have predicted. We don't even have the statistics in yet. I did record a podcast with the sociologist Len Sachs on Martini Judaism, because it's now a podcast, where I interviewed him about what we know about Birthright and what the results of Birthright have been. And it's been an overwhelming success. But the most interesting thing for me is that within a certain number of years, the overwhelming majority of Jews under the age of 35 will have had an experience in Israel. And that will affect what Jewish leadership is going to look like. So I think this is a very, very important piece of the puzzle that has to be drilled down. I think that everything else that we say about Israel pales in comparison. The sense of Israel means that I live beyond myself. It means that I'm not just Jeff Salkin, but I'm part of something bigger, which, by the way, the synagogue should provide for us and does provide for us, but Israel provides for us on a 24/7 news cycle where I am constantly implicated in what goes on, for better or for worse, and I'll take the worst.
So we have to end for now. If you'd like to approach Jeff, you can do so one-on-one. This is only the first night of your several days residency at WRT. I'm giving you a day off tomorrow, bringing you back on Friday night for a celebratory Shabbat service where we will continue to lift up our connection to Israel. We will have Israeli music. We'll have Rabbi Salkin and Roy, who is an incredible, thoughtful, excited advocate for all things Israel. And absolutely, I brought Roy into my 11th and 12th grade session with some of my most eager learners, and just the level of conversation was so elevated, largely because of what Roy has brought to our discussion about Israel all year long. So it's been a wonderful year with you. And we will hear from you on the Bima on Friday night. And then Saturday morning, Rabbi Salkin is teaching Torah study at 9 a.m. Well, minyan followed by Torah study at like 9:30. And then at 11, a congregation-wide conversation, text study, and talk with Rabbi Salkin called How Jews Got Woke. So I know you'll want to come back for all of this. I'll wish you an early Shabbat Shalom, even though it's Wednesday night. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
It's a lot of money. Thank you. Thank you. My pleasure.